Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, a name etched in the pages of American history. This was where 9 students once crossed a line no one dared to cross, just for the right to learn. Today, Central boasts a 96% graduation rate. Its halls are lined with posters that read, "Equity, Opportunity, Empowerment." Teachers complete regular training in student psychology, multicultural education, and global citizenship. But on a warm Monday morning in early April, as sunlight spilled through the school's old stained glass windows and the bell rang to signal second period, Central High bore witness to a moment no award plaque would ever mention. A quiet incident that might have passed unnoticed if someone hadn't stepped in at just the right time. Malik Morrison, 15 years old, a 10th grader, his name didn't mean much to anyone until it showed up on the list of top math scores. No one congratulated him except his mother. No one called him up on stage. But Malik already knew what was coming. Right after second period, the voice came crackling through the PA system from the ceiling speaker. "Malik Morrison, report to Ms. Hewitt's office, immediately." No one in class turned to look. No one smiled. Most likely, they were all thinking the same thing. He must have done something. Malik stood up. His back was straight, but his shoulders trembled just slightly. The boy with tightly coiled hair and warm brown skin, the color of southern soil in midsummer, walked slowly between the rows of desks. Each step felt like walking across an old fear. Not the fear of punishment, but the fear that no one would believe he had earned what he'd achieved. Ms. Hewitt was already waiting in her office, a small room tucked between administrative wings, with frosted glass windows and an old wall clock that always ran 3 minutes slow. She'd taught math for 17 years, known for her precision and ironclad classroom rules. People said she never gave out an A unless she'd personally witnessed steady, consistent improvement. The problem was, Malik had never been part of anyone's plan for steady improvement. When he walked in, Ms. Hewitt sat upright, hands folded neatly on the wooden desk. The surface was spotless, except for 2 tests laid side by side. One belonged to Malik, the other to Luke Thompson, the white student who sat next to him, son of a well-known local realtor, and the golden boy in most teachers' eyes. Ms. Hewitt didn't speak right away. She looked at Malik the way someone might look at a hairline crack in a window pane, bothered, suspicious, impossible to ignore. "Do you know why I called you in, Malik?" she asked, her tone flat, like reading out a notice. Malik nodded slightly, then shook his head. "Because the math test, right?" "Correct. And that's why I need to ask. How did you manage to complete this test?" "I studied every night for the past month. Spare me the story," she cut in, her voice sharpening. "You expect me to believe that you, a student who's never scored above a C, suddenly earned an A, while seated right next to the top-performing student in class?" Malik stood frozen. His right hand reached for the hem of his shirt, gripping it lightly, then letting go. It was a habit he'd had since he was 8, something he did whenever a teacher scolded him, and he wasn't sure how to speak without crying. "I didn't copy. I really studied. I can show you my notes. I did the practice problems. "Malik," Miss Hewitt said slowly, each syllable landing with weight, "don't waste my time. I want the truth." There was a pause. Then, tilting her head slightly, she added, "I know students like you try hard to prove yourselves. But there are better ways to do that, not by cheating." Malik heard every word. They pierced like pins in his ears. His lips tightened. He didn't argue, just silence. And his eyes shifted to the window, where soft sunlight touched the terracotta roof tiles outside, quiet and unbothered. Just like him. Because he knew deep down that at Central High, no matter how many historic doors had been opened decades ago, some doors were never meant to open for a black student simply because he excelled. The air in the room had turned thick, as if someone had shut the windows from the inside and sealed off every breath of freedom with an invisible layer of authority and bias. Malik was still standing there, eyes locked on the 2 test papers on the desk, as if staring long enough might summon the truth into the eyes of the adult before him. But no, there was no curiosity in Ms. Hewitt's gaze, no effort to understand, only a verdict already written, just waiting for him to lower his head and sign. You couldn't have scored this high unless you copied someone, she said, her voice sharp as a razor. No more tiptoeing, just an axe coming down on a small, trembling branch. And clearly, you copied from the white student sitting next to you. Malik flinched. The words white student didn't just land like a comparison. They fell like a standard, a sacred, untouchable benchmark that he had just violated. For a few seconds, his lips parted, but no sound came out. Then, summoning every ounce of courage a 15-year-old could muster from the depths of his chest, he spoke, softly but steady. I didn't copy. I studied all month. My mom helped me study every night. I did practice tests. I redid last year's problems. I wrote down every formula. His voice caught in his throat, but his eyes still held on to hope. Hope that just for one moment, his teacher might see him as a kid who tried, not as a criminal waiting to confess. That's enough, Ms. Hewitt snapped. Her tone was no longer that of a teacher. She braced herself against the desk and leaned forward, close enough for Malik to see the creases at the corners of her eyes. A kid like you, good at math, she scoffed, the sound cold and bitter. Please, Malik, I've been teaching for over 20 years. I know what's possible. I know who has ability and who's just looking for a shortcut. You don't know me, Malik said. His voice rose, not in defiance, but as if the insult had finally struck something buried inside. You don't know how hard I studied. You don't know what my mom sacrificed to help me through this test. Oh, I know, she cut in, voice dripping with sarcasm. I know all about that little narrative. Kids like you, black kids, you're always saying the system's against you, but then you cheat the first chance you get and expect everyone to call it effort. Malik's cheeks burned, not from shame, but from an old ache. The kind that flared up every time his mother told him about being pulled over by police for random checks on her way home from work. A pain with no real name, as deep as a scar that never healed, just waiting for the right insult to split it open. In the hallway, footsteps passed by. Mr. Langston from history, then Ms. Bridges from the counseling office. Through the frosted glass, they could see Ms. Hewitt pointing at a paper, and Malik standing frozen, his face clouded like a sky turning to storm. But no one knocked. No one asked what was going on. No one wanted to question, respected Ms. Hewitt. In fact, when Ms. Bridges turned away, she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for the words to slip through the half-open door. Here we go again. No one spoke up. No one stepped in. No one seemed to believe that a black boy, not because he cheated, but because he'd actually studied, could achieve something they never expected him to. Ms. Hewitt leaned back, tapping her pen lightly on the desk like a judge finalizing a sentence. I'll be notifying the office that your test will need to be reviewed, she said, voice calm, almost clinical. And in the meantime, Malik, I suggest you think about coming clean. Sometimes taking responsibility is part of growing up. Malik said nothing. He turned his head toward the window, where the light no longer poured in, just a pale, dust-streaked pane catching the dim remnants of sun. No one could hear the scream that echoed inside him. No one saw the shame, but in that moment something cracked and grew. Not anger, understanding, the kind that whispers, "You're on your own." The room remained still. The air carried a faint scent of old paper and industrial floor cleaner. Malik stood there, surrounded by the weight of doubt, pressed down on him like a steel door that no one else could feel. And just as he lowered his head slightly, not out of guilt, but from the helplessness that comes with being judged before being heard, the sound of heels echoed down the hallway. Quick, measured, not rushed, but not hesitating either. Not the beat of time, but something heavier, the sound of justice approaching. The door swung open. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped inside. She wore a sharply tailored indigo suit. Her natural curls fell softly to her shoulders. Her dark brown eyes held that sharpness one only earns through experience, the kind that knows where silence lingers, injustice usually hides. A guest badge was still pinned to her chest. Guest speaker, Central High School. But she wasn't heading to the auditorium. She'd stopped because she'd heard something. Words too loud, too cruel to ignore. drifting out from a room with fogged glass, and the kind of stale stillness that seemed to cling to too many places in America, still unwilling to clean their lens when it came to black children. The moment she entered, the air shifted. It was as if someone had vacuumed the oxygen out of the room. Ms. Hewitt looked up and froze for just a second, recognizing that this wasn't a student or a parent. This was a woman she'd seen on CNN last week, someone who'd silenced an entire congressional panel with a single unflinching question. "What exactly is going on here?" Crockett asked, her voice low but deep, echoing like a drop in a well. The room fell into immediate silence. Malik turned his head. Ms. Hewitt tensed. "Oh, Congresswoman Crockett," she said, forcing a smile, "just addressing a potential case of plagiarism, cheating on a test. Is that so?" Crockett tilted her head slightly, eyes fixed on Hewitt. "And the potential case, would that be this young man here?" "Yes," Hewitt pointed toward Malik. "He scored unusually high, sat next to the top student in class. Several identical answers. Given his academic history, it just doesn't add up." Crockett stepped forward. One hand pressed against the desk. Her voice dropped lower, but cut deeper. "Doesn't add up, or you just don't want to believe it?" "Excuse me? You're accusing this boy because he's black and hasn't previously achieved your version of noteworthy performance. Let me guess, if Luke, the white student he sat next to, had gotten the same grade, you'd be clapping, praising him, putting his picture up on the honor board? I'm not being Stop, don't say that," Crockett cut her off, hand raised, voice hard. "I'm not being racist is the weakest shield people like you hide behind when they've been exposed. You don't need to scream the N-word to be biased. You just have to do exactly what you're doing now. Assume that a black child couldn't possibly be excellent unless he cheated." Ms. Hewitt's face flushed. Her lips quivered, searching for a rebuttal. But there was none strong enough to push back against Crockett's words. Words honed like scalpels, cutting straight to the rot. Crockett turned to Malik and stepped beside him. The boy still stood there, tears gathering in his eyes, jaw clenched tight to hold back the dam. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and in that moment, his gaze cracked open. Not out of weakness, but because someone had finally seen him and believed him. He cried, not loudly, but fully. A release of everything he had held in, quiet, buried, and now finally free. Crockett turned back to Ms. Hewitt once more. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "It's because of looks like yours," she said, "that black children grow up surrounded by doubt. They don't just study harder, they have to prepare to defend themselves for succeeding. Because when they do well, someone like you is always waiting to tear them down." Then she looked back to Malik. Her voice softened, but each word still landed with the force of a final declaration. "This is why I fight. For kids like you, who've had their dignity stolen, just because grown-ups refuse to believe in what's possible when it comes from black excellence." Malik stood there, tears drying but eyes brighter now. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Because for the first time, it wasn't just his mother or a friend. It was someone with power, someone with a voice, and she had chosen to use it for him, and she hadn't flinched. Miss Hewitt sat frozen. Outside the frosted glass, a few students had gathered in hushed clusters, murmuring, watching the back of the woman who had just shattered a silence they'd all assumed was too sacred to challenge. Jasmine Crockett walked out of the room, but not out of the story, and she didn't stay silent. Less than 30 minutes later, she stepped up to the podium in the school auditorium, where teachers, students, and members of the local press had gathered for what was meant to be an inspirational guest talk. But she knew the speech she'd prepared no longer fit, because inspiration doesn't come from numbers or slogans. It comes from truth, and sometimes from the humiliation of a child, punished for daring to shine. That afternoon, Central High's assembly didn't feel like any talk that had ever taken place there before. It wasn't the bold backdrop reading, "Ignite Potential," a conversation with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't the local reporters who had expected to stay 10 minutes and leave. It was the air, something unseeable, but deeply felt. Something had happened, and it was spreading like ripples from an epicenter. Crockett stepped onto the stage. No notes, no slides, No polished introduction. She stood tall, the lights casting shadows across the strong lines of her face. She looked fierce, but when her eyes scanned the rows of students, her gaze softened, like someone who had just come through a storm and now only wanted to protect the seedlings trying to grow through the cracks. "Before I came here today," she began, her voice firm, steady into the microphone, "I had a prepared speech." A quiet rustle moved through the front rows. She paused, took a breath, then turned her eyes directly toward the teacher section. "But I won't be reading it today, because less than an hour ago, right here in this school, I witnessed a black student being humiliated, dismissed, and accused by the very person who should have been uplifting him. Not because he cheated, but because he did better than what someone else decided he was capable of." The room froze. Hundreds of eyes shifted. In the third row, Miss Hewitt sat still, her hands clasped tightly, lips pressed together like trying to swallow a stone. "I'm not going to name names today, not to shame anyone, but I am going to name the issue, because silence in rooms like that is how injustice survives." Crockett stopped. Her eyes lit, not with anger, but with clarity. She didn't have to raise her voice. The truth had a volume of its own. "In that moment, I saw a boy, standing alone, untrusted, unprotected, and worst of all, surrounded by adults who walked past, heard everything, and chose to do nothing." A teacher in the back shifted uncomfortably. A few students turned to whisper, unsure whether to look at each other or at the floor. And then Crockett lowered her voice. Not as a politician, not as a public figure, but as a sister, a mother, someone who had lived that silence, and now stood there to speak for those who never got the chance to. "To the black students in this room, hear me clearly. You do not have to apologize for being brilliant. You do not have to be accepted to be worthy of the spotlight. Your talent is real. Your effort is real. And no matter who doubts you, I, and many others out there, are standing right behind you." The students didn't cheer. They didn't move. They just listened. The kind of listening that comes when words don't just land in ears but in hearts. Because somewhere in those rows, they had all seen themselves. In the way Malik lowered his gaze, in the way his shoulders tensed when called out, in the silent apologies they'd learned to offer, just for doing better than expected. Crockett stepped forward, lowering the microphone to her lips. "I didn't come here just to speak. I came here to act." The room lifted their eyes. "Starting this month," she continued, "I will be working with community organizations in Little Rock to launch a scholarship fund, specifically for the students of color at Central High. Not just to compete, but so you never have to be afraid to shine." Now the students began to clap. A few even stood. Malik, sitting quietly in the back, still had his head down, but his eyes glowed. No more tears. Only the look of someone who had just been given back the most important thing, the belief that he was worthy. Congresswoman Crockett ended with one simple line, but it would echo in the minds of everyone who was there that day. Never judge a student by their old file, if you've never bothered to ask about the story behind it. 1 week later, Malik Morrison was called up to the stage during a school-wide assembly. There were no drums, no colored lights. Just the principal, this time speaking in a low, warm voice, eyes softer than usual, announcing that Malik's test had been independently reviewed by a panel of teachers. And the verdict was clear. He did everything right. No signs of cheating, no violations. For the first time, Malik walked up to the podium without lowering his gaze. He walked steady, still a little nervous, but his hands were no longer tucked behind his back. And in his eyes, there was no trace of shame, only a quiet light, steady and unmistakable, of a child who had just found himself again after the storm. Applause broke out, not loud but growing, rising from students, from a few younger teachers. Ms. Hewitt was absent. She had requested a short leave, but Malik no longer cared. Because what he needed wasn't punishment. What he needed was to be believed, to be seen through the lens of fairness. In one corner of the auditorium, a chair remained empty, the same chair where Jasmine Crockett had sat the week before. She had left quietly after her speech. No headlines, no praise. but she left behind a presence that stayed. A boy stood tall because someone stood up for him. A community changed because one woman refused to stay silent. That line, handwritten, was later printed by a student group and taped below a framed photo of her, hung along the second-floor hallway where Malik walked by every day, alongside other black students still carrying dreams that had been denied for far too long. The Dare to Shine Scholarship was officially announced the following month, launched by Crockett in collaboration with the Black community of Little Rock. Its mission? To support students of color, not to prove anything to others, but to affirm to themselves that they have the right to dream. Malik didn't say much after that day, but sometimes people saw him in the library, holding a book on advanced math, mumbling equations under his breath, as if the path he was on, still long, had finally found a light to follow. And when someone asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, he answered softly. But his eyes were clear. I want to teach math. I want to teach kids like me that they can. This story doesn't end with some grand victory. It doesn't end with a dramatic ruling. It ends with a boy who no longer saw himself as the problem. Not everyone can change the world, but anyone can start by protecting a child who's been hurt.